Imagine standing in a room where the old powers of the world still believe they can lecture others on democracy, freedom, and progress. Now picture an Indian voice, calm, precise, unapologetic, cutting through that arrogance with a single truth: the world has changed, and so has India. For too long, the West viewed India as a classroom to be taught, a market to be exploited, or a pawn to be moved on a global chessboard. But today, that illusion collapses. In that moment, an American challenger, full of assumptions, is silenced not by aggression, but by unshakable facts. And the truth bomb dropped is not just about India, it's about the shifting balance of global power. This is where history meets the present, and it's impossible to ignore. They arrived with certainty. A young American voice armed with sound bites, convinced that cultural superiority and a habit of critique equated to moral authority. It was a classic posture: confident, provocative, eager to assign labels. What followed was not a theatrical slugfest, but a surgical correction. Not insults, not bluster, but facts laid out with clinical clarity. For decades, many in the West deployed a tidy narrative of India as a study in delays and dysfunction, a storyline that fit headlines and paternalistic commentary. Yet narratives fracture when confronted with sustained evidence. The Indian reply did not mimic the heat of the interrogation. It answered with outcomes: long-term institutional resilience, sweeping economic transformation, a booming technology and entrepreneurial ecosystem, rising connectivity and literacy, tangible strides in manufacturing and services, and a global diaspora that amplifies influence and trade. This clash is epistemic rather than merely rhetorical. One side relied on assumptions and selective memory, the other relied on measurable performance. That distinction is profound. When condescension meets data, the condescension quickly loses purchase. Calm, fact-based rebuttal exposes the weak foundations of easy judgments and forces a reappraisal of who deserves the podium. This wasn't empty nationalistic bravado, it was disciplined persuasion, proof over provocation. The American interlocutor wielded inherited narratives. The Indian respondent wielded demonstrable progress. The practical lesson for any observer is sharp: halt the reflex of loud certainty and audit claims against reality. Credit follows competence. Respect is earned through results, not through the volume of denunciation. That moment, where a presumed superior voice is quieted by evidence, teaches both humility to critics and confidence to the critiqued. In geopolitics, as in debate, outcomes rewrite reputations, and truth, calmly presented, tends to win. Listen to the evidence, update your assumptions. The world is not obliged to fit old stories. History has a cruel habit of underestimating nations until they rewrite the script. For centuries, India was spoken of as a land rich in resources but poor in power, a jewel to be taken rather than a voice to be heard. Colonial exploitation left scars deep in the national fabric: famine, economic plunder, cultural suppression. The story told by others was always of weakness, dependence, or chaos. Yet what is extraordinary is not the suffering, but the resilience that followed. From the ashes of partition and poverty, India built institutions that endure, a democracy that persists against the odds, and a society that refuses to be defined by past chains. The transformation has been staggering. In one lifetime, India has traveled from begging for grain shipments to launching satellites into space and feeding its own people. Once dismissed as a passive recipient of aid, it is now a decisive player in shaping the global economy. The energy that fuels this rise is not borrowed. It is homegrown, forged in the determination of millions who believed that survival alone was not enough. They wanted progress, and they created it through education, industry, and relentless innovation. What the world often forgets is that this ascent was not accompanied by conquest or colonization, but by sheer persistence. India's credibility is not built on military muscle or imperial nostalgia, but on proving that democracy and development can coexist in one of the most diverse nations on earth. That is why the old caricatures no longer fit. The weak, dependent India of history exists only in the faded imagination of those unwilling to look again. The present reality is of a nation that has endured its hardest battles already, and emerged too strong, too ambitious, and too self-assured to be spoken down to ever again. Western eyes often see what they want to see: a chaotic marketplace, a noisy democracy, an uneven patchwork of growth. What they rarely confront is the sheer scale of India's economic metamorphosis. For decades, the stereotype painted India as a country of poverty, bureaucracy, and missed opportunities. But reality has moved far beyond that caricature. Year after year, India has emerged as one of the fastest growing major economies, posting figures that even established powers struggle to match. It is no longer the nation waiting for instructions from the IMF or World Bank. It is a market that investors chase, a hub that technology giants depend upon, and a workforce that underpins global innovation. Consider the transformation in sectors that matter most: technology, pharmaceuticals, space, digital infrastructure. These are not vanity projects, they are foundations of modern power. Millions now conduct transactions through digital platforms at a scale that leaves Western systems looking outdated. Pharmaceutical exports sustain global health supply chains. Satellite launches are offered at competitive prices to countries far wealthier. This is not the profile of a struggling nation. It is the profile of an economic power rewriting its own story. What unsettles critics is that this rise undermines the old assumption that prosperity flows only from the West. For decades, India was positioned as a recipient of wisdom and wealth. Today it is a contributor, shaping markets, setting standards, and challenging monopolies. Economic respect is not gifted, it is earned through consistent delivery, and that is precisely what has happened. The days when Western commentators could dismiss India with lazy tropes are over. The numbers are too compelling, the impact too visible, and the momentum too strong. The truth is simple: economics has a way of silencing outdated prejudices, and India's growth is doing exactly that. For much of the 20th century, the assumption in global politics was simple: power lay in the West, and others aligned themselves accordingly. Nations were measured by how faithfully they followed Washington, London, or Brussels. That age is over. The shift is unmistakable, and India embodies it more clearly than most. It is not a camp follower, not an extension of someone else's agenda, but a strategic force charting its own path. This is what unsettles so many critics: the refusal to be neatly categorized as pro-West or pro-East. Instead, the answer is always the same: pro-India. Look at the choices being made. Partnerships with the United States in technology and defense coexist with strong ties to Russia in energy. Trade flourishes with Europe while investment deepens with the Gulf. Dialogue continues with China even as security is fortified along the border. This is not contradiction, it is sovereignty. It is the art of balancing relationships without surrendering independence. Too often the West believes alignment means obedience, but here lies the correction. Alignment today is transactional, interest-driven, and temporary. What makes this shift profound is that it forces older powers to acknowledge limits. No lecture, no threat, no incentive will persuade India to compromise its core interests. In climate negotiations, in trade disputes, in security councils, the voice is firm and autonomous. That is how genuine multipolarity looks: nations refusing to bend to a single authority and instead defining their own role in the system. This is not the India of dependence, nor the India seeking validation. It is a nation negotiating as an equal, reminding the world that the era of singular dominance is finished. Global politics has entered a new phase, and balance, not obedience, is the new currency of respect. Respect is never inherited, it is claimed through hard realities. For years, the global conversation carried an unspoken hierarchy, one where some nations presumed the right to lecture, while others were expected to listen. That imbalance was tolerated when economic strength and military dominance made it unavoidable. But the brutal truth now is that the foundations of that hierarchy are cracking. India is no longer the junior partner in the room, waiting for approval or applause. It sits across the table as an equal, and increasingly, as a challenger when the conversation drifts into arrogance. What silenced the American voice in that exchange was not rudeness or aggression, but the simple force of evidence. Poverty rates falling, industries expanding, influence growing in every corridor from the G20 to the UN. These are not abstract statistics. They are the realities that shape how nations are perceived and how power is distributed. The uncomfortable lesson for critics is this: the era when the West could dictate the terms of respect is over. Today, respect is a transaction, earned through resilience, achievement, and vision. The tone has shifted from deference to assertion. When confronted with outdated assumptions, the response is no longer defensive. It is declarative. This is who we are. This is what we have achieved, and this is why your narrative no longer applies. That is the truth bomb. Not a weapon of hostility, but a blunt exposure of reality. The world can choose to adjust to it or cling to illusions, but the direction of travel is obvious. Nations that once dictated are now forced to negotiate, and those once dismissed are now shaping the agenda. Equality is not granted, it is demanded, and in this new order, India insists on nothing less. So what do we take away from this exchange? It's not just about one rebuttal in one debate. It's about a larger lesson for all of us. Never accept the world exactly as it is told to you. Question assumptions, challenge stereotypes, and measure nations and people by their actions, not by the outdated stories attached to them. The truth bomb that silenced arrogance wasn't loud or hostile. It was calm, it was factual, and it was undeniable. And that is a reminder for each of us in life, as in Geopolitics. The most powerful voice is the one armed with truth. Facts don't shout, but they do echo. Carry that with you. Because the ability to stand tall, to speak with conviction, and to demand respect on equal terms is not just India's story. It can be yours too.